What does it truly mean to be strong? Is strength measured by the force you can unleash upon an enemy, the raw, crushing power to dominate and destroy? Or is it something far harder to define? Perhaps real strength lives somewhere else entirely, in the chest of a man who refuses to move when every circumstance demands he retreat, in the quiet, unannounced decision to hold ground when fear screams at him to run, in the stillness of a man kneeling in prayer while the walls around him crumble to dust. We talk about strength constantly, in gyms and boardrooms and political speeches, but we rarely pause long enough to ask what kind of strength actually matters when the world is burning around you and no rescue is coming. That question, as it turns out, was answered definitively over 400 years ago, on a sun-scorched island in the heart of the Mediterranean, when 500 warrior monks of the Knights of St. John stood against 40,000 soldiers of the most powerful military force on earth and refused to fall. Consider what that image means. Not a vast army, not a coalition of nations. 500 men, many of them old, most of them already wounded from previous campaigns, planting their feet against a tide that had swallowed empires. The reasonable thing, the rational thing, would have been to negotiate or retreat. Instead, they loaded their weapons, prayed the rosary, and waited. This was not simple military courage. It was something older and deeper than courage. It was the behavior of men who had settled the most important question in their lives long before any enemy appeared on the horizon. This was not simply a military engagement. It was the most consequential test of human will and spiritual conviction in the history of the Christian West. It asked the deepest question a man can face. Not whether he is strong enough to win, but whether he is strong enough to stand regardless of the outcome. The answer that came from those battered walls in 1565 still echoes across the centuries. It speaks to something that has been quietly lost in the modern age. The understanding that genuine strength is not built from self-belief alone. It is forged through oath, sustained through suffering, and anchored in a will surrendered to something infinitely greater than itself. What happened on Malta was not merely military history. It was a lesson in the architecture of the human soul, written in blood and prayer on the stones of a small and unlikely island. In the summer of 1565, a vast Ottoman armada darkened the horizon of the Mediterranean. 40,000 of the Sultan's most elite soldiers, including his legendary janissaries, warriors raised from childhood with a single purpose, sailed toward the island of Malta with orders to wipe its defenders from the face of the earth. The crescent banners stretched across the water. The war drums echoed over the waves. The Ottoman Empire had never been stopped. It had consumed kingdoms, swallowed cities, and reduced the greatest fortresses on earth to rubble. There was no reason to believe Malta would be any different. Waiting on the island were 500 Knights of St. John and a few thousand Maltese volunteers. The Knights were no ordinary fighting men. They were Catholic warrior monks, men who had renounced wealth and comfort, taken solemn vows before God, and spent their entire lives preparing for this. They had fought across the Holy Land, protected pilgrims on perilous roads, and been driven from every territory they swore to hold as the Ottoman tide swept westward. Rhodes had fallen. Their other strongholds had crumbled. Malta was the last. If this island fell, the road to Rome lay open, and the era of Christian Europe would be measured in months. Their Grand Master, Jean de Valette, 70 years old, hardened by decades of war, offered his knights no false hope. He gave them something better: clarity. A man anchored in faith and duty does not bend to odds. He does not calculate whether survival is probable. He holds the line. The first phase of the siege centered on Fort St. Elmo, guarding the Grand Harbor entrance. For 28 days, its defenders repelled wave after wave of assault. When their weapons shattered, they fought with whatever their hands could find. When the fort finally fell, it took 6,000 Ottoman soldiers with it, every man inside dying at his post. The Turks crucified the bodies of the fallen knights and floated them across the harbor as a warning. De Valette answered by firing the heads of Ottoman prisoners back across the water as cannonballs. This was a war for civilization itself. Through June and July, the island burned. The survivors boiled leather for soup. They rebuilt collapsed walls in darkness with bleeding hands and prayed the rosary at dawn and dusk, even as they dressed their wounds. Disease swept through the Ottoman camps. Tens of thousands of the Sultan's finest lay dead. And still, from across the harbor, the voices of the defenders rose in hymns. Men with no rational reason to be alive, praising God in the ruins. September brought relief. Barely 6,000 Spanish and Italian soldiers, far less than anyone had hoped. But it was enough. De Valette opened the gates. The surviving knights, gaunt, bloodied, some barely able to stand, charged out crying for God and St. John. The greatest army on earth turned and fled. The siege was over. Malta had held. 30,000 Ottoman soldiers never returned home from Malta. The news swept across Europe within days, and cathedral bells rang from Rome to Paris. The Pope declared it an act of divine providence. Historians would mark it as one of the pivotal turning points in Western history, the moment when the westward march of the Ottoman Empire reached its outermost limit and was turned back. The Christian world had been handed an unexpected century of breathing room. But the real question is not how they won. The real question is why they stood in the first place. You have likely heard the phrase, "Discipline is freedom." Malta is the purest illustration of it that history has ever produced. The Knights of St. John did not hold their ground because they calculated favorable odds, or because a general speech stirred their emotions, or because they felt particularly courageous that summer. They held because they had sworn an oath before God, and in that vow, they had already made the most important decision of their lives long before the first cannon fired. This is a truth the modern world has largely abandoned. Freedom is not the absence of constraint. It is the result of submitting to the right constraints, the ones that bring your will into alignment with truth. When a man has genuinely surrendered himself to God, fear stops being the dominant voice. Appetite loses its grip. Circumstance loses its power to dictate behavior. The knights had trained their bodies to obey their souls, and their souls to obey Christ. So when everything collapsed around them, there was nothing left to collapse within them. They had already died to themselves before the battle began. This is also why they prayed the rosary before fighting. It was not superstition or sentiment. They understood that the Mass is the central act of human history, that every time the chalice is lifted, something eternal occurs. They did not merely attend that reality, they imitated it, offering their suffering as a continuation of it. And because of that, their pain was not meaningless, it was redemptive. In Catholic theology, suffering is the forge, the place where pride is stripped away, where love is tested, where a man discovers whether his faith is real or merely decorative. The other lesson Malta teaches is about brotherhood. Not one knight stood alone on those walls. They prayed together, fought together, and rebuilt together in the dark. This is the logic of the Church, not a scattered collection of private believers pursuing independent spiritual journeys, but a unified body in which every part suffers and recovers together. This generation, raised on radical individualism and the myth of self-sufficiency, is quietly starving for exactly that. We have been taught that reliance on others is weakness. The knights understood the opposite. Dependence on God and on brothers who share your mission is what forges unbreakable strength. Modern Christianity has, in many places, grown comfortable with a version of faith that asks very little of the body and not much more of the soul. We speak of grace while quietly avoiding discipline. We desire resurrection without any real confrontation with crucifixion. We want the light at the end without walking the tunnel. We celebrate the saints without seriously asking what it was that made them saints, what habits they kept, what appetites they refused, what oaths they took, and how seriously they honored them. Malta exposes this comfortable drift for what it is, not faith, but a feeling dressed in faith's clothing, one that performs well in peaceful times and dissolves at the first sign of real pressure. Grace and effort were never opposites in the Christian tradition. They were always designed to work together, each one requiring and strengthening the other. The Church does not simply invite you to hold an opinion about God. It calls you to bind yourself to Him through formal vows, disciplined habits, bodily sacrifice, and a community of brothers and sisters who hold you to account when you would rather settle for less. The secular world may label this control, or repression, or a failure of self-expression. What it actually is the only genuine freedom available to a human being. Because a man whose will is truly bound to truth is no longer ruled by everything else, no longer enslaved to his moods, his appetites, his fears, or the approval of others. He can stand, not on the power of his own emotion, which rises and falls like weather, but on the bedrock of conviction. That is precisely what the Knights of St. John stood on. Not inspiration, not adrenaline. Conviction. Their courage in the end was not their own. It was something borrowed, drawn from an infinite and inexhaustible source. That is the beating heart of Catholicism. Not a collection of moral principles or inspiring ideas, but an actual, living encounter with God Himself. A faith that does not merely motivate you to act, but genuinely transforms the kind of person you are from the inside out. Faith without structure crumbles the moment real pressure arrives. But faith given shape through prayer, penance, sacrament, and brotherhood can outlast any siege, any empire, any age that history can produce. The Roman Catholic Church has outlived every civilization that has attempted to bury it. That is not coincidence or luck. It is what happens when truth refuses to move, while everything around it does. So take the lesson from those men on the walls of Malta. Kneel before God. Stand beside your brothers. And on the days when you feel lost, when you wonder what kind of man you are supposed to be, and whether you have what it genuinely takes, remember Malta. Remember that God has never once needed a majority. He has only ever needed a few men willing to hold the wall when the world demands they abandon it.